ladies and gentlemen, you know, one of the most curious things about the way we're taught to read is that it often has very little to do with understanding and a lot to do with surviving. We read to pass exams, to underline the important parts, to memorize what someone else has already figured out. In other words, we read like students. Now, if there's one thing Richard Feynman loved to point out, it's this. Knowing the words isn't the same as understanding the idea perfectly and still have no clue what it actually means. So today, I want to ask a simple question. What would happen if we stopped reading, like students, reading like curious human beings, not to pass a test, not to impress anyone, but to actually figure things out,
To wrestle with ideas, to question them, to break them, and maybe even enjoy the process. Because the truth is, the moment you stop reading like a student is the moment you finally stop learning.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know, one of the most curious things about the way we are taught to read is that it often has very little to do with understanding and a lot to do with surviving along the way. Reading stopped being an adventure and became a strategy, a technique, a way to get through something rather than into it. We highlight sentences, we memorize definitions, we try to guess what might appear on the test. And if we're honest, most of the time, we're not really asking, do I understand this? But rather, will this be enough? When you think about it, imagine listening to music, not to hear it, but just to pass a quiz about it later. Or watching a movie while constantly worrying about remembering the characters' names instead of actually experiencing the story. Yet that's exactly how many of us approach reading. We reduce it to a task, something to complete, something to check off a list. If there's one thing Richard Feynman made very clear, it's that there is a huge difference between knowing something and understanding it. Talk about how easy it is to fool yourself into thinking you understand something just because you can repeat the words. I can read a paragraph 10 times, underline every sentence, and still not truly grasp what's going on. The words are familiar, but the meaning remains distant. And that's where the problem begins. Because when we read like students, we start valuing recognition over comprehension. Oh yes, I've seen this before, and we move on. But recognizing a sentence is not the same as understanding an idea. Seeing a map of a city and assuming you actually walked its streets, real reading, the kind that actually changes the way you think, is much slower, much messier, and sometimes even uncomfortable. It involves stopping in the middle of a page and admitting, I don't get this. It means going back, evaluating, questioning the author, and sometimes even disagreeing. Therefore, curiosity and a willingness to look a little foolish, especially to yourself. But that's exactly what makes it powerful. Because the moment you stop trying to look smart and start trying to understand, something shifts. You begin to engage with ideas instead of just collecting them. Asking questions like, why does this make sense? Or what would happen if this were wrong? Or even, how would I explain this to someone else? And that last question is particularly important. Feynman himself believed that if you can't explain something in simple terms, you probably don't understand it well enough. Not because you're not intelligent, but because the idea hasn't fully settled in your mind yet. It's still floating around as part of knowledge, not something you've truly made your own. So imagine approaching every piece of reading with that mindset, not as a student trying to pass, but as a curious thinker trying to figure something out. Yeah, rushing through pages, you slow down and explore them. Instead of accepting everything at face value, you test it, question it, play with it. Add us like puzzles rather than instructions. And suddenly reading becomes something entirely different. It's no longer about finishing chapters or preparing for exams. It becomes a process of discovery where every paragraph is an opportunity to see the world a little more clearly, to challenge what you thought you knew, and to build understanding piece by piece. Not because you have to, but because you genuinely want to. So today, I want to ask a simple question. What would happen if we stopped reading like students, but reading like curious human beings, not to pass a test, not to impress anyone, but to actually figure things out, to put ideas, to question them, to break them, and maybe even enjoy the process. Because when you think about it, curiosity is the most natural thing in the world. Yet in children all the time. They don't read or learn because they're told to. They do it because they want to understand how things work. They ask questions constantly, sometimes annoying, sometimes brilliant, but always honest. They're not worried of being right, they're interested in finding out. And along the way, that curiosity gets replaced with caution. We start worrying about whether we're interpreting something correctly, whether our questions sound intelligent, whether we're keeping up with everyone else. Without even realizing it, we begin to read more carefully, but think less freely. That's the trade-off we rarely notice. We become efficient readers, but not necessarily better thinkers. You go through pages quickly, pick out key points, and summarize arguments. But when it comes to actually engaging with the ideas, we hold back. We don't challenge them. We don't play with them. We don't push them to their limits. Now imagine flipping that completely. Teacher reading something and immediately asking, do I believe this? Not in a defensive way, but in an exploratory one. What if you treated every idea like a hypothesis instead of a fact? What if instead of trying to remember what the author said, you try to test it in your own mind? This is very much in the spirit of Richard Feynman, who was famous for not accepting things just because they sounded smart or came from an authority. He had this habit of taking complicated ideas and breaking them down until they either made sense or fell apart. And he didn't mind which one happened. Discovering that something doesn't make sense can be just as valuable as understanding it. That's a completely different way of reading. Because parents reading it into a kind of experiment. That book isn't a set of answers. It's a starting point. Someone you have to agree with. There's someone you can have a conversation with. And your role isn't to absorb everything perfectly, but to interact with it actively.
But they interact with it.
You might pause and think, if this is true, what consequences? Or can I come up with an example that proves this wrong? Or even, how would I explain this in my own words without using any of the same phrases? These kinds of students force you to engage more deeply, to move beyond the surface level and into the structure of the idea itself. And yes, it takes more effort, sometimes frustrated and often uncertain. You won't always feel like you're making progress, and you won't always arrive at clear answers. But that uncertainty is actually part of the process. It means you're thinking, not just repeating. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. You stop being intimidated by difficult material. Instead of seeing complexity as a barrier, you start seeing it as a challenge. You become more comfortable saying, I don't understand this yet, and more confident in your ability to eventually figure it out. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to enjoy it. Not because it's easy, but because it's engaging, because it feels real, because instead of passively receiving information, you're actively building understanding, piece by piece, idea by idea, question by question, driven not by obligation, but by genuine curiosity about how things work and why they make sense. Because the truth is, the moment you stop reading like a student, that's it. You finally start learning, and that shift doesn't happen all at once. It begins in small, almost invisible ways, in the way you pause a little longer on a confusing sentence, in the way you allow yourself to question something instead of immediately accepting it, in the way you become comfortable not having all the answers right away. A long time, many of us are trained to avoid that discomfort. We're taught that not understanding something is a problem, something to fix as quickly as possible. So we rush through difficult parts, hoping clarity will appear later, or we memorize explanations without really digesting them. We move forward, but without building a solid foundation underneath. Real learning doesn't work like about speed, and it's certainly not about perfection. About building connections between ideas, between concepts, between what you already know and what you're trying to understand. And those connections take time. They require patience, attention, and a willingness to sit with confusion a little longer than feels comfortable. This is something Richard Feynman demonstrated throughout his life. He didn't treat confusion as a weakness, he treated it as a signal. If something didn't make sense, that was exactly where he focused his attention. Instead of avoiding the difficult parts, he leaned into them to take an idea apart, piece by piece, until he could see how it actually worked, or until he discovered that it didn't quite hold together the way it was presented. That approach changes everything.
That approach changes everything.
Because instead of trying to protect your sense of competence, you start prioritizing understanding. You give yourself permission to be a beginner again, even in subjects you studied for years. Worrying about how you look and start focusing on what you're actually thinking. And with that comes a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence of having all the right answers, but the confidence of knowing you can figure things out. Confidence that comes from engaging deeply, from struggling with ideas, and eventually making sense of them in your own way. It also changes how you interact with information. You're no longer just collecting facts. You're building a framework. Each new idea has a place, a relationship to something else. You begin to see patterns, to recognize underlying principles, to connect ideas across different subjects, being a series of isolated tasks and becomes part of a larger, ongoing process of understanding the world. And perhaps one of the most important shifts is this. You stop being afraid, being wrong. When you read like a student, being wrong feels like failure. To avoid, something that might cost you marks or recognition. But when you read to truly learn, being wrong becomes part of the process. Refine your thinking, how you test your assumptions, how you move closer to clarity. You might form an interpretation, test it, realize it doesn't quite work, and then adjust it. The action of trying, failing, and refining is where real understanding is built. It's not neat and it's not always satisfying in the moment, but it's incredibly effective over time. And so, instead of rushing to finish, you begin to slow down. Instead of aiming to get everything right on the first try, you allow yourself to explore. You read not just with your eyes, with your mind fully engaged, questioning, connecting, imagining, and rethinking as you go, turning each page not into a checkpoint, but into an opportunity to think more deeply, more clearly, to think more deeply, more clearly, and more independently. So if we're serious about this idea, about stopping reading like students and starting to think more like curious, independent learners, then the real question becomes, how do we actually do it? Lying in theory, but in practice, most of us fall back into old habits without even noticing. The first shift is surprisingly simple, but not easy. You have to slow down, not just physically by reading fewer pages, but mentally. Give yourself permission to pause in the middle of something and say, wait, what does that actually mean? That moment when you interrupt the flow to question it is where real engagement begins. It might feel inefficient at first, especially if you're used to measuring progress by how much you've covered, but depth and speed rarely go together. Another important change is learning to translate ideas into your own words. Very easy to nod along with something that sounds sophisticated, especially when it's written in polished language. If you translate it simply, without relying on the same phrases, then you're probably still holding on to the surface rather than the structure at a strongly way. This was one of the habits strongly associated with Richard Feynman. He would take complex ideas and explain them as if he were teaching someone with no background at all. not to simplify the idea itself, but to test whether you truly understood it. Then there's the habit of asking better questions. Asking, what does this say? You start asking, why does this make sense? Or what assumptions is this built on? Or what assumptions is this built on? Or even what would happen if this idea were applied somewhere else? That words, as that stretch of thinking, they force you to move beyond the text and into the logic behind it. So begin to treat reading as a kind of dialogue rather than a one-way process. The author presents an idea, and instead of accepting it immediately, you respond. Agree, disagree, feel uncertain, or want to test it further. You might even imagine how the author would respond to your objections. This turns reading into something active, almost like a conversation happening in your own mind. And importantly, you have to get comfortable with confusion again. To avoid, but as something to avoid. When a section doesn't make sense, instead of skipping it or glossing over it, you stay with it a little longer. Please stay with it a little longer. Break it apart. Look for examples or connect it to something you already understand. Like what? Sometimes clarity comes quickly. Sometimes it doesn't, but the act of staying with the difficulty is what builds real comprehension. There's also value in stepping away and coming back. Your mind can get stuck in a loop. Taking a break, letting the idea settle, often allows you to return with a fresh perspective. But after something that felt complicated starts to look more manageable, not because it changed, but because your understanding did. And over time, as you practice these habits, something subtle begins to shift. You stop reading just to get through material and start reading to engage with it. You become less concerned with finishing and more interested in figuring things out. The pages don't feel like a checklist anymore. They feel like a space where your thinking is being shaped, challenged in ways that go far beyond simply remembering what was written, and instead move toward truly understanding how ideas connect, evolve, and make sense in the first place.